Good evening. My name is Phil Easter, historian and writer from Baltimore, Maryland, also known as the Amazing Memory Man. We're recording tonight on Monday, April 29th, 2024. This is story number 51 on my YouTube channel, which is Phil Easter, the Amazing Memory Man. Tonight I'm going to share a few stories of the times I've enjoyed sports at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, starting way back in 1967. Just briefly, I would like to note this date, April 29th, two important events I know off the top of my head for this day from years past. One of my favorite actors, Irish-born Daniel Day-Lewis, he was born in Ireland on April 29th, 1958. He starred in some movies like Lincoln, where he was outstanding as America's greatest president in the movie Lincoln about 12 years ago. He won his third Best Actor Oscar for that movie. The only man to ever win 3 Oscars in movie history for Best Actor of the Year. But also, one of my favorite movies of all time was the 1992 film romantic adventure story called The Last of the Mohicans, which Daniel Day-Lewis co-starred with the beautiful actress Madeleine Stowe. So happy 66th birthday to Daniel Day-Lewis. Also, on this day in 1985, 39 years ago, I lived at the Mount Vernon area of Baltimore for many years near the Washington Monument down there, and walking by the monument at about 4 o'clock in the afternoon on Monday, April 29th, 1985, I looked over to the supposedly correct inauguration date that's been put on the monument way back in 1838, now close to 200 years. And apparently even then, about 150 years or so, nobody noticed that it was wrong. And so a couple months later, I made front page news in the Evening Sun newspaper on July 8th, 1985, an article under President Reagan. He was president at the time, here where it says, "Oh my God, it's wrong, monumental error in the city." Where it says 4 March 1789, the date was April 30th that he became president. April 30th, 1789, not March 4th that year. So the people who put the inscriptions on the monument regarding important events in his life, also his birth and death dates, which are correct, but they got this one wrong, the first inauguration, the first president of the United States. And the second page of the article went into many examples of many dates I know off the top of my head from history. For even back then in 1985, I knew at least 320 dates of the year, at least one event, sometimes more than one. And I share my knowledge with people. I can always tell somebody something famous happened on their birthday without any notes in front of me. And I enjoy sharing my knowledge and stories with people. So that was 39 years ago today, the monumental error that I discovered. I started going to Hopkins lacrosse games in 1967 when I was a freshman in high school, and for a number of years it was the sport of lacrosse I saw at Hopkins. But then, and that's the sport that Hopkins is best known for, going back to the late 1800s, really, 19th century. The great American game of lacrosse, invented by the Indians. You don't get much more American than that. And Johns Hopkins University has won something like pretty close to 42 national championships, I believe. Now, in some years, before 1971, if teams ended up with a similar record, they would share the championship. So a couple times, 2 or 3 teams shared the championship before the tournament came about in 1971, when the sport of lacrosse then came under the NCAA. But altogether, somewhere close to 42 national championships Hopkins has won in lacrosse. A very memorable game I saw in 1968, Hopkins in Maryland. The first time I saw Hopkins play Maryland in particular. A very exciting game, and it was at Hopkins, and Maryland was up by 1 goal, 8-7 at the end of the third quarter. But in the fourth quarter, Hopkins came back to score 3 goals to win 10-8. And that was the last game of the season, and effectively it was the national championship game in a way. They didn't call it at the time because I said that before the tournament came about, whoever had the best record would win. But effectively speaking, it was a championship. But in 1972, the second year of the official NCAA tournament, I saw Hopkins play at the University of Virginia at Maryland, College Park. It was held there. But Hopkins of Virginia played an exciting game. Hopkins came up 1 goal short, losing to Virginia 13-12. Very exciting game. I was hoping Hopkins would win, but I was happy to see a national championship in lacrosse. And many years later, in 2003, the first year that the lacrosse championships are now held at big football stadiums, no longer on college campuses, for the men's teams at least. I think the women still play on college campuses for the semifinals and final, but the men play at football stadiums like M&T Bank of Baltimore, and in Philadelphia where the Eagles play, and in Foxborough, Massachusetts where the Patriots play. Since 2003, the men's championship seems to alternate between those 3 stadiums every year. So in 2003, once again, it was Hopkins and Virginia. Virginia won by 2 goals, 9-7. But finally, in 2007, the third time I ever went to a championship game that Hopkins was playing in, I was happy to see Hopkins beat Duke, a close game, 12-11 at M&T Bank Stadium. And finally, after watching Hopkins lacrosse for 40 years, so many games, probably around 100 at least, mostly men's games and some women's games too, but finally I got to see Hopkins win a national championship in person, which was really special. I'd seen them win on TV before, but I never got to see them win the championship in person until 2007. In 2014, I started to have some medical problems 10 years ago, and for the first time in many years, I did not get to one lacrosse game at Hopkins that year. And the next several years, I think I got to just one game each year through 2018. And then at the end of 2019, I had a stroke and hip fractures, which I still have. The fractures have not healed very well, and it's harder for me to get around now. I have to use a wheelchair or walker much of the time, and somebody has to take me to events. I can't just walk to the campus like I did for some years. I live just 1 mile away at this time. And at one point I lived across the street at 100 West University Parkway back in the late 80s and early 90s. And that was really convenient to see Hopkins sports events right across the street from Homewood Field. But I'm very happy that recently, on Saturday, April 20th, I got to see my first Hopkins lacrosse game in 6 years, not since 2018. Until April 20, 2024, I saw Hopkins and Maryland play, and Hopkins won by a score of 7-5. I was very happy to see that, and I went with a friend named Noah, who never saw a lacrosse game before in his life. He's originally from Baltimore, Ohio, little town of Baltimore in Ohio, then lived in San Diego, and now has lived here since 2007. So it's very nice to share that with someone who had never seen a lacrosse game. But I've also seen many other sports at Hopkins over the years: soccer, basketball, baseball, football, field hockey, volleyball, water polo, swimming and diving, and track meets too. And I think I once saw a cross-country meet years ago that ended at halftime of a football game, so they could get more people to applaud the runners. There wouldn't be many people just watching the cross-country meet alone. I saw one fencing match. I think I've seen every sport at Hopkins at least once except wrestling. Maybe next year in the winter sports season I'll get over there to see a wrestling match just to say I've seen every sport at Hopkins at that point. But it's been a great joy over the years seeing many sports at Johns Hopkins. Now in lacrosse they are Division I for both men and women, which is the highest division in college sports. But in all other sports they're Division III. But they're among the best teams in Division III quite often. Last year, the baseball team finished second of all colleges in Division III. 2 years ago, the women's soccer team won the national championship of Division III in 2022. I was very happy for the girls to win that championship. I went to one of the home games that year, and in cross country, I believe their women's cross country team has won the national championship as many as 5 times in the last 10 or 12 years. It's really amazing to win that many times. And the men's swimming team, way back in 1977, 78, 79, won 3 straight Division III national championships. One of the great figures in Johns Hopkins sports history was Mr. Bob Scott. Bob Scott was an All-American lacrosse player when he went to Hopkins in the late 40s and then graduated in 1952. He also played football, and he was an All-American lacrosse player. And then after serving 2 years in the Army, the rest of the jobs he had for the rest of his life were all at Johns Hopkins as assistant lacrosse coach for 1 year, then the head coach for about 20 or 21 seasons, and then he became athletic director of all the sports for about 21 or 22 years. A very nice man, Bob Scott, and I knew him personally. I met him a number of times. And in 2007, one night I was at a basketball game, and I brought one of the 2 books he wrote about lacrosse. I bought one of them some years ago, and he was very nice to autograph the book for me, which I appreciated very much. Bob Scott, athlete, coach, and athletic director, a wonderful man who served Johns Hopkins so well for so many years. And in the year 2016, they were getting ready to commission a statue for him, but sadly he died on September 15th, 2016, just before the statue was ready to be shown to the public. 1 month later, exactly, on October 15th, there was a memorial service at the gym, and somewhere around 800 to 1,000 people attended that, I believe. It was a very nice memorial service. And then at about 6:30 that evening, we went out to the field where the statue was unveiled, exactly 1 month after he died. The statue of Bob Scott is at one of the entrances to Homewood Field. I also knew the next athletic director, Mr. Tom Calder. Tom Calder grew up in Long Island, New York, and he played lacrosse and football at Hofstra University. He later worked at the University of North Carolina for a while, but in 1988 he came to Hopkins and was assistant athletic director to Bob Scott at that point. And in 1995, when Bob Scott retired, Tom Calder became athletic director and held that position until July 1st, 2016. But he still worked at Hopkins for 4 more years in another department and then retired in 2020. I remember a night back in 2002, it was December 4th, 2002, a few days before, I convinced Tom to go down to the Naval Academy to drive us down to watch the Hopkins men's basketball team play Navy. Hopkins had played Navy in basketball something like 17 times before that and always lost. But that night of December 4th, 2002, Hopkins men beat Navy 66 to 61, I believe it was. It was just about 5 or 6 points, but it was very exciting to see Hopkins, a Division III basketball school, beat a Division I school. You don't see that too often. Talk about an upset. And 5 years later, Tom Calder drove me to the University of Maryland to see the Hopkins-Maryland lacrosse game at Maryland. And that was a real nice treat. I'd seen Hopkins, Maryland play many times at Hopkins, but it was also nice to go down to Maryland to see the game. And I've seen a number of women's sports at Hopkins too, including lacrosse and soccer games. I think I've seen more women's soccer games than men's soccer. And at basketball, it's, by my best estimation, it's about evenly divided between men and women's games I've seen over the years. So it's been a great experience to see many sports at Johns Hopkins University. I only wish I could go more often, but I am able to go at least once in a while still. I'm very happy to be able to do that. I estimate I've seen probably somewhere around 350 to 400 sports events at Johns Hopkins since 1967. It's been very enjoyable to go there to see sports events at Johns Hopkins University. This is Phil Easter, the Amazing Memory Man. Thank you for joining us this evening for this story. We'll see you next time for story number 52, another story on another subject. Thank you and good night.